At 4:30, when the village ordinarily returned to itself after the minor strain of tea, the sound of footsteps crossed the upper floor of Bellringer House. This, in itself, was not remarkable. Bellringer House was old, and old houses made a habit of noises that had no intention behind them. They creaked as if remembering, sighed as if disagreeing, and occasionally produced a footstep that belonged to no one in particular. What made this different was that 3 people heard it, and none of them could agree on what it meant. Mrs. Violet Bellringer was downstairs in the morning room, seated in a chair she had not yet decided to give away. She had poured herself tea she did not especially want, and was watching it cool with an expression that suggested the tea had personally disappointed her. When the sound came, measured, deliberate, crossing from the back of the house toward the front, she did not look up at once. Instead, she waited, as if expecting the noise to correct itself. It did not. She placed her cup down with care, as though any sudden movement might invite further disturbances. Then she looked toward the ceiling, where the plaster rose in a gentle, unreliable curve. "Well," she said quietly, "to no one at all. That's new." Upstairs, Miss Clara Fenchurch had paused halfway between the linen cupboard and the spare bedroom. She was holding a folded sheet, and her first thought upon hearing the footsteps was irritation. Bellringer House had been empty long enough to learn its habits, and footsteps were not among them. Draughts moved doors, pipes knocked in the evenings, but footsteps belonged to people, and Miss Fenchurch disliked surprises that suggested company. She stood still and listened. The sound came again, slower now, and stopped near the top of the stairs. Miss Fenchurch's irritation cooled into something more careful. She did not call out. Calling out implied welcome, or at least expectation, and she was prepared for neither. Instead, she waited, the sheet still folded in her hands, and counted 3 quiet seconds. Nothing followed. Downstairs, Mr. Harold Pike, who had not intended to stay as long as he had, adjusted his hat unnecessarily. He was standing near the sideboard, pretending to read the spines of books he had already read in other houses. When the footsteps sounded, he turned slightly, as if to locate them, then felt foolish for doing so. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Politely, because politeness was how one addressed confusion. Mrs. Bellringer did not answer at once. She was still looking upward, her gaze steady rather than alarmed. "Yes," she said finally. "I did." Mr. Pike nodded. He nodded too often. In general, but now it seemed appropriate. "Sounded like someone crossing the landing." So it did. They did not look at each other. Looking at each other would have required one of them to offer an explanation, and neither felt prepared to do so. Bellringer House had been quieter than usual since Mr. Bellringer's death 6 months earlier. The village had adjusted with what it liked to believe was sensitivity. Meals arrived unannounced but expected. Invitations were extended with an air of obligation disguised as kindness. People spoke more softly in rooms that did not require it. The house, however, had not adjusted at all. When Inspector Jonathan Hale arrived later that evening, it was not in response to an emergency. He came because Mrs. Bellringer had written a letter. The letter was brief, neatly spaced, and entirely free of adjectives. It stated that something odd had occurred, that it was probably nothing, and that she would appreciate his opinion if he happened to have one. Inspector Hale was polite enough to take this as an invitation. He arrived just before dusk, when the light along the lane thinned and the hedges lost their certainty. He removed his hat at the door, as though the house itself might be offended by improper manners, and accepted tea without asking what kind it was. "You heard footsteps?" he said, once he had listened to Mrs. Bellringer's account. He did. Not phrase it as a question. Yes. And you were alone? I was, she said. Unless the house is keeping secrets. Inspector Hale smiled faintly. It was not a reassuring smile, but it was not an alarming one either. It suggested patience. Miss Fenchurch was invited in from the hall, where she had been listening with interest, she would later deny. Mr. Pike lingered near the doorway, uncertain whether he was still expected to be present. No one dismissed him, so he stayed. Each described the sound differently. Mrs. Bellringer insisted it was measured. Miss Fenchurch described it as hesitant. Mr. Pike thought it purposeful, though he admitted he could not explain why. Inspector Hale listened without interruption. He asked no questions about locks or windows or the precise age of the floorboards. Instead, he asked where each of them had been standing and what they had been thinking just before the sound occurred. This puzzled them. Thoughts, he explained mildly, are often louder than they appear. When he finally rose to leave, the house had grown quieter than before, not emptied, but attentive. At the door, Mrs. Bellringer said, "You don't think I imagined it?" "No," Inspector Hale said. "I think you noticed it." She considered this, then nodded. Upstairs, the landing remained still, but the floor, if one listened closely enough, did not sound entirely convinced. Bellringer House did not object to being examined, but it did not assist either. The hall received Inspector Hale the next morning with a polite blankness, as though it had already decided nothing would be discovered there. Light from the high window rested along the floorboards without settling, and the staircase rose in, a manner that suggested effort rather than invitation. Mrs. Bellringer stood beside the umbrella stand, her hands folded loosely, as if waiting for instructions she did not intend to follow. Miss Fenchurch lingered a little behind her, maintaining the careful posture of someone who wished to appear useful without becoming involved. Mr. Pike, who had arrived under the reasonable pretext of returning a book, remained near the door, prepared to leave at the first sign of relevance. Inspector Hale removed his gloves and placed them in his coat pocket, an action performed slowly enough to imply thought rather than warmth. He did not look up the stairs immediately. Instead, he studied the hall itself, the width of it, the way voices might carry if anyone were inclined to raise them. "It's a generous space," he said, as if speaking of a public building rather than a private house. "My husband liked it," Mrs. Bellringer replied. "He said halls were meant for people, not furniture." And now, she said, "it is mostly for passing through." Inspector Hale nodded. He walked a short distance toward the stairs, then stopped as though reconsidering the value of forward movement. "When the sound occurred," he said, "this hall would have been empty." "Yes." "And quiet?" "As it generally is," she said. "Quieter than it used to be?" Miss Fenchurch shifted slightly. "It carries, though," she said. "Even small sounds." Inspector Hale turned to her with interest that did not feel accidental. "You've noticed that?" "One can't help it," she replied. "When one spends time here," Mr. Pike cleared his throat softly. "I've always thought," he said, "that houses remember when they were busier." No one contradicted him. The inspector did not encourage him either. He took one step onto the first stair, then paused again, listening not upward but behind him, as though measuring the silence in the hall. "Mrs. Bellringer," he said, "you mentioned that the sound crossed from back to front." "Yes." "And you were seated where?" "In the morning room. The door was open." "So the sound travelled?" "Yes." Inspector Hale considered this. He stepped back down and walked slowly across the hall, his shoes making no effort to disguise themselves. The sound they produced was faint, uneven, and entirely unimpressive. "Different?" Mrs. Bellringer said. "Yes," he agreed, "but not unrelated." They moved together then, not as a group, but as a series of individual decisions that happened to align. The inspector crossed the hall again, this time nearer the wall, and the sound changed subtly, becoming sharper, more distinct. Miss Fenchurch inhaled. "That's closer. Closer," he said, stopping. But still not quite it. He turned toward the cupboard beneath the stairs, opened it without comment, and closed it again. The sound echoed briefly, then vanished. Mr. Pike frowned. That sounded louder. "Doors announce themselves," the inspector said. "Footsteps do not wish to be heard." Mrs. Bellringer watched him carefully. "You think it was someone moving with purpose?" "I think," he said, "that it was something that wanted to pass unnoticed." She absorbed this without visible reaction. They did not go upstairs immediately. Instead, Inspector Hale asked them to speak, not loudly, but normally, from different positions in the hall. The request caused mild embarrassment, which he accepted as part of the process. Voices rose and fell, overlapped briefly, then withdrew. The hall responded by amplifying some sounds and diminishing others, as if applying its own judgments. "This was once a social space," the inspector observed. "People would have spoken here, waited here, listened." Mrs. Bellringer smiled, faintly. "Now it mostly waits." They climbed the stairs at last, each step sounding different from the imagined ones of the previous afternoon. At the top, the landing lay open and undecorated, a place without intention. Inspector Hale stopped where the sound had stopped. He did not bend or touch the floor. He simply stood, head slightly inclined, as though acknowledging an acquaintance. "Whatever passed through here," he said quietly, "did not linger." Miss Fenchurch looked toward the far end of the landing. "Then why hear it at all?" The inspector did not answer at once. When he did, it was without emphasis. "Because," he said, "someone was listening." The landing light shifted as the afternoon thinned, not darkening so much as withdrawing its confidence. Inspector Hale remained where he was for a moment, after speaking, then turned without ceremony toward the nearest window. It was tall, narrow, and slightly bowed, the glass uneven enough to soften the view of the garden beyond. He did not open it. He simply looked. Mrs. Bellringer watched him with an attention that had become habitual. Since her husband's death, attention had been the one thing she could still offer freely. Miss Fenchurch stood a little apart, hand folded, already anticipating that she might later be asked what she had noticed and wishing privately that she had noticed something clearer. "These windows," the inspector said, "were replaced at some point." "Yes," Mrs. Bellringer replied. "After the war, the originals rattled terribly." "And these?" "They remember the rattling," she said, "but they don't repeat it." Inspector Hale smiled faintly. He leaned closer, not to the latch or the frame, but to the glass itself. From this angle, the landing reflected faintly back at him. The pale runner carpet, the curve of the banister, three figures arranged with more restraint than comfort. "From here," he said, "one can see the path clearly." The garden path curved away from the house, its stones worn smooth by feet that had not always belonged to the same people. It was visible from several windows, but this one held it longest, tracking its length almost to the gate. "I often stand here," Mrs. Bellringer said, then paused as though surprised by her own admission. "In the evenings." "To watch?" "To remember," she corrected quietly. Miss Fenchurch shifted. "The sound didn't come from outside," she said. "I'm certain of that." Inspector Hale turned to her. "You've ruled it out?" "Yes." It was inside, very clearly. He nodded, accepting her certainty without comment. "Nevertheless," he said, "windows have a habit of complicating things." They moved along the landing together. Each window offered a slightly different view, not only of the garden but of the house itself, reflected at odd angles. In one, the staircase appeared steeper than it was. In another, the far bedroom door seemed closer, as though it might open of its own accord. Mr. Pike, who had followed them upstairs with mild reluctance, stopped beside the third window. "I remember," he said, "when you could hear people coming up the path long before they reached the door." Mrs. Bellringer glanced at him. "You remember many things," she said, not unkindly. Inspector Hale noted the exchange but did not pursue it. Instead, he asked, "On the afternoon in question, did anyone pass the windows?" Mrs. Bellringer considered. "No one I noticed." "And you were watching?" "Yes," Miss Fenchurch frowned. "But you said you were in the morning room." "I was," Mrs. Bellringer replied. "Before that?" Inspector Hale allowed this to rest. Time, he knew, rarely behaved itself in memory. He stopped at the far end of the landing, where the window overlooked the rear of the house. From here, the path was no longer visible, but the kitchen yard lay open, quiet and unoccupied. This window, he said, would show someone leaving. "If they used the back," Miss Fenchurch said. Indeed, she hesitated. No one did. "Inspector." Hale looked at her steadily. "You're certain?" "Yes." "How?" "Because," she said, "I was there." This altered the air slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Mrs. Bellringer turned to Miss Fenchurch with an expression that combined surprise and something like apology. "You didn't say," she said. "There was no reason," Miss Fenchurch replied. At the time, Inspector Hale waited. Silence, he had found, often encouraged fuller answers than questions. "I had just come down from the spare room," Miss Fenchurch continued. "I crossed the landing. I was about to go down the stairs when I heard it." "The footsteps?" "Yes." "And the back door?" "I could see it," she said, "from the window." "No one passed through the yard." Inspector Hale nodded slowly. "So the sound occurred while you were here and no one left that way?" "Yes." "And the front?" "I would have heard it," Mrs. Bellringer said, "or seen them pass." They stood together, framed by glass that reflected them imperfectly. The house felt neither accused nor absolved, merely attentive. Inspector Hale stepped closer to the window again, this time touching the frame lightly, not as a test, but as an acknowledgement. "Houses," he said, "are very good at preserving patterns." Mrs. Bellringer said nothing. "People," he continued, "are less reliable. They alter their routes, their habits, sometimes without noticing." He turned from the window at last. "What matters," he said, "is not who might have passed, but who would have expected to be seen." Miss Fenchurch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the glass. Downstairs, a door closed quietly, though no one could later say which one. They did not discuss the closed door at once. It would have been impolite to do so, and politeness in Bellringer House was rarely abandoned without careful preparation. Instead, they returned downstairs together, their descent quieter than their ascent, as though the house had already taken note of them and found no reason to comment further. Tea was offered again and accepted by habit rather than desire. Mrs. Bellringer poured with steady hands. Miss Fenchurch arranged the cups with unnecessary precision. Mr. Pike hovered near the edge of usefulness, contributing by moving a chair that did not require it. Inspector Hale sat where he had sat before, his posture unchanged, as though continuity itself were a form of reassurance. He spoke first not of footsteps or doors, but of weather. The frost had been light, the path would have softened by afternoon. Mud, he remarked, had a way of revealing enthusiasm. There was none, Mrs. Bellringer said. I would have noticed. Yes, he said mildly. You are attentive. She accepted this without pleasure. Being attentive had become less a virtue than a condition. Conversation settled into a careful rhythm. Miss Fenchurch spoke of linen deliveries. Mr. Pike mentioned the post being late again. Each remark hovered briefly, then retreated, leaving behind a sense that something else might have been said instead. Inspector Hale listened with interest that appeared evenly distributed. When he finally spoke again, it was with the same quiet tone. People are often most careful, he said, when they believe they are being kind. Mrs. Bellringer looked at him. You think someone meant no harm? I think, he replied, that harm is rarely how such things begin. Miss Fenchurch's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. Then what do you think it began as? The inspector considered. An assumption, he said. Politely made. Mr. Pike laughed softly, then stopped when no one joined him. We're very good at that here, he said. Assuming? Yes, Mrs. Bellringer said. We assume we know what is best for one another. Inspector Hale inclined his head. And sometimes you do. Silence followed. Longer this time. Not uncomfortable, but deliberate. Outside, a bird landed briefly on the sill, then departed, apparently dissatisfied. Miss Fenchurch, the inspector said at last, you said you were on the landing when the sound occurred. Yes. And you had not expected anyone else to be in the house? No. But if someone had been, he continued, it would not have been entirely impossible. She hesitated. No, she admitted. Not impossible. Mrs. Bellringer's gaze shifted, not sharply, but enough to register. You had a key, she said. Miss Fenchurch nodded. For practical reasons. Of course, Inspector Hale did not intervene. He allowed the moment to pass naturally, like a pause in conversation that revealed more than an interruption ever could. And Mr. Pike, he said, turning slightly, you arrived shortly after. I did, Mr. Pike said quickly. But the sound had already occurred, or so you were told about it? Yes. And formed an opinion. Mr. Pike smiled uncertainly. I thought it odd, but not alarming. No, Inspector Hale leaned back slightly. Oddness, he said, is often easier to live with than implication. Mrs. Bellringer set her cup down. You're suggesting, she said, that someone was here who believed they had a right to be. I'm suggesting, he replied, that someone believed their presence would be understood. Miss Fenchurch frowned. Understood by whom? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked, Who would expect you to be in the morning room at that hour, Mrs. Bellringer? She considered. Anyone who knows my habits? And who would that be? She smiled thinly. More people than I'd like, the inspector nodded. And who would expect the landing to be empty? Miss Fenchurch's expression tightened. Most people. And who, he continued, would expect to pass through the house without being noticed? No one spoke. The question did not accuse. It rested among them, shaped carefully enough to invite agreement rather than resistance. Mr. Pike cleared his throat again. If someone thought they were helping, he said, they might not think to announce themselves. Quite, Inspector Hale said, especially if they believed their visit was anticipated. Mrs. Bellringer's voice was calm. No one was anticipated. No, he agreed. But some expectations persist after they have been withdrawn. The air in the room felt subtly altered, as though a window had been opened somewhere out of sight. Miss Fenchurch stood and crossed to the sideboard, adjusting a plate that did not need adjustment. "I didn't see anyone leave," she said again, more firmly this time. "No," the inspector said, which suggests they did not intend to, Mrs. Bellringer looked at him steadily. "Then where are they now?" Inspector Hale met her gaze without difficulty. "Still within the pattern," he said. "Wherever that may be." He rose to take his leave shortly after, declining further tea. At the door, he paused, his hand resting briefly on the frame. "Suspicion?" he said. "Need not be rude." When he had gone, the house felt quieter again, but not relieved. Somewhere upstairs the floor settled with a sound that might have been a footstep, or might not. After Inspector Hale's departure, Bellringer House resumed its careful quiet, the kind that held, rather than emptied, a room. Mrs. Bellringer remained seated longer than necessary, her hands folded, her gaze directed not at the door, but at the space it framed. Miss Fenchurch busied herself with clearing cups that were not yet cold. Mr. Pike lingered until politeness required his leaving, which he did with apologies that suggested he felt none were quite sufficient. Once alone, the two women moved through the house without speaking. Their paths crossed and diverged, not deliberately, but according to habits neither had thought to question. Mrs. Bellringer paused in the morning room, touching the back of her chair as if confirming its presence. Miss Fenchurch went to the kitchen, where she stood for a moment listening, though she could not later say to what. It was in the early evening, when sound travelled more freely, that the first misunderstanding occurred. Mrs. Bellringer, passing the foot of the stairs, heard voices. They were not loud, nor were they distinct enough to suggest words. They rose and fell briefly, then ceased. She stopped, her hand resting on the banister, and listened again. Nothing followed. She did not call out. She did not move. Instead, she waited, her attention narrowing to the shape of the silence. After a moment, she continued on her way, telling herself that old houses borrowed sounds from memory as readily as they borrowed light. Upstairs, Miss Fenchurch was in the spare room, folding linen with care that bordered on reverence. She heard nothing at first. Then faintly a murmur reached her as though someone had spoken from behind a closed door. It was too indistinct to identify and too brief to investigate. She paused, the sheet half folded, and considered whether to listen more closely. She decided against it. Later, when the lamps were lit and the house settled into evening, Mrs. Bellringer mentioned the voices casually, as one might mention a change in weather. "Did you say something earlier?" she asked, her tone even. Miss Fenchurch looked up, surprised. "No. I thought I heard voices near the stairs." Miss Fenchurch hesitated. "I was upstairs. Yes. But I didn't speak." Mrs. Bellringer nodded. Then it was nothing. They accepted this explanation with mutual relief. Nothing, after all, required no response. The following morning, however, brought complication. Inspector Hale returned, not unannounced, but without ceremony. He was invited in, offered tea, and seated once more. His manner suggested neither urgency nor ease, but something between, as though he were continuing a thought rather than beginning one. "I wanted," he said, "to ask about voices." Mrs. Bellringer stiffened slightly. Miss Fenchurch remained still. "Voices," Mrs. Bellringer repeated. "Yes." "Were any heard after I left?" Mrs. Bellringer considered, then answered carefully. "I thought I heard something." "And you?" he asked Miss Fenchurch. She hesitated. "Possibly," Inspector Hale nodded. "Not clearly." "No." "And not words." "No." He leaned back slightly. "Then tell me what you did not hear." They exchanged glances. "I did not hear," Mrs. Bellringer said slowly, "anyone come in nor leave," Miss Fenchurch added. "I did not hear the stairs," Mrs. Bellringer continued. nor the front door. And you, the inspector said to Miss Fenchurch, did not hear anyone upstairs with you? No, he smiled faintly. That is helpful. Miss Fenchurch frowned. It is? Yes, he said, because people often mistake what they have not heard for what did not occur. Mrs. Bellringer watched him closely. You think someone was speaking? I think, he replied, that something was said. By whom? That, he said, is the question. He asked then about the house's habits, where sound carried, where it did not, which doors muffled voices and which amplified them. Miss Fenchurch answered readily. Mrs. Bellringer filled in what she could. Between them a map of sound emerged, imperfect but suggestive. And the morning room, he asked, is particularly good at retaining voices. Mrs. Bellringer nodded. My husband used to say it listened better than people. Inspector Hale smiled. Wise man. He rose to walk the room, stopping where Mrs. Bellringer had been seated the previous afternoon. From there he spoke softly, testing the space. His voice carried upward, then faded. Someone speaking here, he said, might believe they were unheard. Miss Fenchurch's expression tightened. But we were here. Yes, he agreed, which is why it mattered what you were listening for. Silence followed, not awkward, but attentive. I did not hear anger, Mrs. Bellringer said quietly, nor urgency. No, the inspector said. Those announced themselves. Then what was it? Miss Fenchurch asked. He did not answer at once. Instead, he looked toward the stairs, his expression thoughtful. Reassurance, he said finally. Or the attempt at it. Mrs. Bellringer's hands folded more tightly. Reassurance for whom? Inspector Hale met her gaze. For someone who believed they were entitled to offer it. Miss Fenchurch looked away. When he left again, the house seemed to hold its breath. That evening, no voices were heard, or perhaps they were, but not recognized as such. What was certain was this. Something had been said, and something had been withheld. And between the two, the house waited, patient as ever. The days that followed did not distinguish themselves by incident. That, in itself, became notable. Bellringer House settled into a rhythm that was neither new nor quite the old one, but something adapted, like a person learning to walk with a slight alteration to balance. Mrs. Bellringer woke at the same hour. Each morning opened the same curtains and stood for a moment longer than she once had, as if waiting for the light to offer instruction. Miss Fenchurch continued her duties with the careful diligence of someone who believed order, properly maintained, might eventually answer questions it had not yet acknowledged. Inspector Hale did not return at once. This absence was not felt as neglect, but as intention. Mrs. Bellringer understood this, though she did not say so. She had lived long enough to recognize the difference between attention withheld and attention deferred. It was during these quiet days that the house's smaller habits became more noticeable. The way the back door resisted closing unless guided by a firm but patient hand, the tendency of the third stair to protest only in the evening, the faint click from the study window when the temperature shifted. None of these were new. What was new was the attention paid to them, as though each small behavior might be rehearsing something larger. Miss Fenchurch was the first to speak of it. "They're not his habits," she said one morning, arranging cutlery with care that bordered on reproach. "But they're not yours either." Mrs. Bellringer considered this while buttering toast. "They belong to the house," she said. "He merely indulged them." "And now?" "And now," she replied, "they've been inherited." Miss Fenchurch did not smile. Inheritance, she had learned, rarely arrived without complication. Later that day, Mr. Pike called again, this time with the stated intention of checking on Mrs. Bellringer's well-being. He brought biscuits of a type her husband had disliked, which she accepted without comment. They sat in the morning room, the chairs positioned with habitual correctness. "I was thinking," Mr. Pike said, after a moment, that suggested he had been thinking for some time, "about that afternoon." Mrs. Bellringer did not look at him. "Many people are." "Yes," he said. "But I was thinking specifically about who knew what." She turned then, her expression mild but attentive. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, adjusting his cuffs, "your routines were rather well known." "Were they?" "You had tea at 4, you read until 5. You rarely went upstairs at that hour." Mrs. Bellringer nodded slowly. "That was true." "And your husband," Mr. Pike continued, "used to walk the house in the afternoons, always the same route." "Yes." "From the study," he said, "through the hall, up the stairs, along the landing, then back down." Mrs. Bellringer's hand paused. "You noticed that? It's hard not to notice a man who walks as though he's checking on things that don't require checking." She smiled faintly. "He liked to know where everything was." "And now," Mr. Pike said carefully, "those habits have nowhere to go." Mrs. Bellringer said nothing. The room felt fuller, as though the furniture had drawn closer together. That evening, Miss Fenchurch discovered that the study door had been left open. This was unusual. She closed it, then reopened it, testing whether the latch held. It did. She stood for a moment, listening, then went downstairs without comment. When Inspector Hale returned the following afternoon, he did so with the air of a man resuming a conversation already in progress. He accepted tea, declined biscuits, and sat where he could see both the hall and the base of the stairs. "I've been thinking about habits," he said, as though continuing a private line of reasoning. "So have we," Mrs. Bellringer replied. "Good," he said. "Then we're aligned." He asked them to describe Mr. Bellringer's routines, not in outline, but in detail. Where he paused, which doors he touched, how long he lingered at the landing window. Miss Fenchurch provided much of this, her memory precise. Mrs. Bellringer filled in the rest, her tone neutral. "He always stopped here," Miss Fenchurch said, indicating the base of the stairs, as if deciding whether to go up. "And did he?" the inspector asked. "Usually. Unless he'd already been," Mrs. Bellringer said. Inspector Hale nodded. "And did anyone else follow these routes?" They hesitated. "Exactly," Miss Fenchurch said. "But close enough," Mrs. Bellringer added. The inspector leaned forward slightly. "Sometimes," he said, "habits outlive the people who form them." "And someone might continue them," Miss Fenchurch said, "without realizing." "Yes," he replied, "or believing they were honoring them." Mrs. Bellringer's expression tightened. "You're suggesting someone was walking as he used to?" "I'm suggesting," the inspector said gently, "that someone believed the house still expected it." Miss Fenchurch looked toward the stairs. "But that doesn't explain the voices." "No," he agreed. "That explains the footsteps." Silence followed, heavy but controlled. "And who," Mrs. Bellringer asked, "would feel entitled to that?" Inspector Hale did not answer immediately. He rose instead and walked a short distance into the hall, stopping at the point where Mr. Bellringer used to pause. "Someone," he said, "who had already inherited something else." Miss Fenchurch frowned. "What?" He turned back to them. "Responsibility," he said, "or the illusion of it." Mrs. Bellringer exhaled slowly. That's a dangerous inheritance. Yes, he agreed, especially when it's assumed rather than given. As he prepared to leave, Miss Fenchurch spoke suddenly. "The study," she said. "I found the door open." Inspector Hale paused. "And had you left it so?" "No." "And Mrs. Bellringer?" "No," he nodded once. "Then that," he said, "is a habit worth examining." After he had gone, the house resumed its quiet. But it was no longer an empty quiet. It felt occupied by small, persistent motions, habits without owners, moving carefully through rooms that remembered being lived in. Somewhere upstairs, the study door settled into its frame with a sound that suggested satisfaction. By the end of the week, Bellringer House had begun to look subtly altered, though no furniture had been moved with any intention. Mrs. Bellringer noticed it first in the morning room, where a chair seemed closer to the window than it had been, and the table angled itself toward light, as if persuaded rather than shifted. Nothing appeared wrong, yet everything felt recently reconsidered by the house itself, quietly. Miss Fenchurch attributed the changes to dusting until she found the photograph album returned to a shelf she never used. It had been left out deliberately. Days earlier, placed within reach of Mrs. Bellringer's chair, yet now it stood upright, aligned carefully, its spine facing outward, as though the room preferred not to be reminded. She said nothing, but noted the detail precisely, and felt unexpectedly observed by silence alone. Inspector Hale arrived that afternoon to find both women standing in different rooms, listening for reasons to cross the hall. He remarked on the light on the season's reluctance to commit, then asked them to show him what had changed. They struggled to answer because the changes resisted naming and preferred implication. Nothing was missing, yet nothing felt exactly where memory placed it before today or yesterday, either at all. He walked through the house slowly, not measuring distances but reactions. Mrs. Bellringer followed at a respectful remove, observing her own hesitation with interest. Miss Fenchurch paused often, as though waiting for permission from rooms she had managed for years, now uncertain whether familiarity still granted authority. The inspector asked where objects belonged rather than where they stood. Answers varied. According to memory, habit, and expectation, none entirely reliable now. In the study, the desk faced the window again. Mrs. Bellringer was certain she had turned it inward weeks earlier, unable to bear the garden view. Miss Fenchurch disagreed, gently recalling how Mr. Bellringer preferred light while reading. Inspector Hale listened without correcting either account. He examined the floor beneath, noting scuffs that suggested recent, familiar movement. Not hurried, not secretive, simply repeated like practice performed without witnesses or permission. The bedrooms showed similar uncertainty. Drawers sat partly open, closed again with excessive neatness. A blanket lay folded at the foot of the bed, though no one claimed responsibility. Mrs. Bellringer touched it briefly, then withdrew her hand, unsettled less by its presence than by the care taken. Inspector Hale asked who usually folded linen, and silence answered first. Miss Fenchurch admitted it was her task, always methodical, never careless. In the spare room, nothing appeared disturbed at all, which struck the inspector as deliberate. Order can be as expressive as disorder, he remarked, especially when maintained by someone who believes preservation equals respect. Mrs. Bellringer considered this quietly, recalling how absence can invite imitation. They stood there longer than necessary, listening to nothing happen. The room seemed to approve of restraint, withholding comment in a way both familiar now. Downstairs again, Inspector Hale asked them to walk separately through the house, doing whatever felt natural. Mrs. Bellringer moved slowly, pausing at thresholds she once ignored. Miss Fenchurch followed habitual routes, then stopped herself, uncertain whether habit remained appropriate or merely convenient. The inspector observed without directing, interested in hesitation more than motion. Patterns emerged unevenly, shaped by memory, grief, and assumed duty, each revealing something unintended about presence, lingering. It became clear someone had been careful not to disrupt too much. Chairs were returned, doors left as expected, windows unlatched only where habit suggested air. The care itself suggested familiarity deeper than intrusion, the kind born of long observation rather than bold trespass. Inspector Hale asked who benefited from such care continuing unnoticed. No answer satisfied because benefit was not the same as intent, nor comfort equal consent either. Mrs. Bellringer spoke then of kindness, how it can persist after necessity ends. She described neighbors who still corrected her lights, adjusted her windows, or reminded her of appointments unkept. None meant harm, she said, yet each assumed a right once granted never quite expired. Inspector Hale listened closely, hearing explanation where others might hear complaint. He asked who had last been asked to help here. Silence answered again, politely. Miss Fenchurch felt heat rise, uncomfortably aware of her own diligence. She had managed the house through illness and grief, filling gaps without instruction. She said this aloud now, not defensively, but carefully, as though placing an object down. Inspector Hale acknowledged the honesty without absolution. Care, he said gently, can cross into possession unnoticed, especially when everyone prefers continuity to correction. The house rewarded such certainty with silence afterward. As dusk gathered, the rooms seemed satisfied, their arrangement settled for the moment. Inspector Hale prepared to leave, having seen enough to suspect motive without naming it. The house had been rearranged not by force, but by memory attempting stewardship, and that, he suspected, would soon resist remaining quiet. Mrs. Bellringer watched him go, understanding more than she wished. Upstairs, a door rested slightly ajar, unchallenged, as if awaiting instruction. The house did not settle entirely that night. It held itself in readiness, as though expecting correction or permission. Mrs. Bellringer lay awake listening, recognizing the difference between movement and intention. Somewhere, memory walked carefully, testing boundaries it believed still open. No footsteps sounded, yet absence itself felt rehearsed. The rooms waited, arranged just so, for someone to decide otherwise. Morning would ask questions they could not avoid any longer. By then, Inspector Hale knew rearrangement was conversation, not confession. The house spoke through placement and pause, and someone had answered too fluently. What remained was to learn who mistook care for entitlement and how politely that mistake would be corrected before memory attempted something louder. For now, silence remained cooperative, though increasingly selective. Bellringer House waited, attentive, holding its breath carefully, as arrangements promised consequences ahead, soon enough inevitably. The following morning arrived without incident, which made it immediately suspect. Bellringer House greeted the light as it always had, but Mrs. Bellringer sensed a faint impatience in the way the shadows withdrew from the corners. She dressed slowly, not from fatigue, but from an unspoken reluctance to interrupt whatever arrangement the house believed itself to be maintaining. When she reached the landing, she paused, aware that stillness itself now felt like an action requiring justification. Miss Fenchurch was already awake. She moved through the kitchen with deliberate restraint, performing tasks she had performed for years, yet now monitoring each motion as though it might be observed and misinterpreted. She resisted the urge to adjust a chair that sat slightly askew, telling herself that standing still was sometimes the more responsible choice. The chair remained where it was, quietly defiant. They met in the morning room, exchanging greetings that were perfectly civil and faintly provisional. Neither mentioned the night nor the silence that had accompanied it so precisely. Tea was poured, bread sliced, and the day arranged into manageable segments that did not yet include explanation. It was mid-morning when Mr. Pike arrived again, this time without biscuits and with an expression that suggested he had decided something, without yet knowing what it was. He stood in the doorway longer than usual, as though gauging whether his presence would be welcomed or merely endured. Mrs. Bellringer invited him in with a nod that did not commit her to conversation. "I thought I'd walk over," he said unnecessarily. "Clear my head." Miss Fenchurch noted that he did not remove his coat. This, she suspected, was not accidental. They sat together, the three of them arranged in a manner that discouraged comfort. Mr. Pike spoke first of the weather, then of the lane, then stopped, as though recognizing the futility of preamble. "I don't like things changing without being asked," he said finally. Mrs. Bellringer regarded him steadily. "Neither do I." Miss Fenchurch said nothing, but her posture stiffened, as though preparing to defend a position she had not yet claimed. Mr. Pike continued, encouraged by the absence of interruption. "I keep thinking someone means well," he said, "and that makes it harder to object." "Yes," Mrs. Bellringer agreed. "It does." He shifted in his chair. "But meaning well doesn't excuse everything." "No," she said. "It rarely does." Silence followed, weighted but not hostile. Mr. Pike stood abruptly, as if motion were the only remaining option. "I should go," he said. "I've said enough." After he left, the house seemed to lean inward slightly, attentive to what had been acknowledged. Miss Fenchurch stood and crossed to the window, then stopped herself, hands hovering uselessly. Standing still, she realized, was becoming increasingly difficult. Inspector Hale returned that afternoon, as expected. He arrived without haste and was shown in without ceremony. He declined tea this time, choosing instead to remain standing, a decision that subtly altered the balance of the room. "You've noticed," he said, "that stillness has become uncomfortable." Mrs. Bellringer inclined her head. "It feels like neglect or refusal," Miss Fenchurch added. "Yes," the inspector said, "both are forms of resistance." He asked them to describe the morning. They did so carefully, noting what had occurred and what had not. He listened for what remained unsaid. "Someone," he said, "has been maintaining motion here." "Yes," Mrs. Bellringer said, "and now it's being interrupted." Inspector Hale nodded. "People who believe they are responsible often struggle with interruption." Miss Fenchurch spoke then, her voice measured. "I thought," she said, "that keeping things as they were would help." "And did it?" he asked. She hesitated. "At first. And now?" She exhaled. "Now it feels like I'm preventing something." "Change," he said. "Or grief," Mrs. Bellringer said quietly. Inspector Hale regarded them both. "Standing still," he said, "is sometimes mistaken for respect." "And movement?" Miss Fenchurch asked. "Movement," he replied, "requires permission." They sat together then, the conversation having reached a place where further words risked distortion. Outside, the day progressed with indifferent efficiency. Inside, Bellringer House waited, no longer satisfied with careful preservation. "Inspector," Hale prepared to leave, pausing near the base of the stairs. "Someone," he said, "will soon find it difficult not to act." Mrs. Bellringer met his gaze. "And when they do?" "They will reveal what they believe they are owed." After he left, Miss Fenchurch remained standing, uncertain whether sitting would imply acceptance or retreat. Mrs. Bellringer watched her with a gentleness sharpened by clarity. "You don't have to hold everything still," she said. Miss Fenchurch swallowed. "I don't know how to stop." Mrs. Bellringer nodded. "Neither did my husband," she said. "He kept walking long after the house no longer required it." That evening, as light faded and the rooms settled into temporary agreement, a decision seemed to form without sound. The house did not rearrange itself. Nothing moved, and yet the absence of motion felt deliberate, as though someone were waiting for acknowledgement before continuing. Standing still, it seemed, had become the most difficult thing of all. The change, when it came, did not announce itself with sound. There were no footsteps, no voices, no rearranged chairs to prompt immediate remark. Instead, it arrived as a series of small corrections, each reasonable on its own, each justified by habit or courtesy, and all the more persuasive for having no obvious origin. Mrs. Bellringer noticed first that the kitchen light had been switched off behind her. She had left it on deliberately, the late morning cloud having dimmed the room more than she liked. When she returned, the light was out, the switch cool beneath her fingers. She stood for a moment, considering whether she might have misremembered. She had not. Still, she said nothing. Correcting light usage had once been her husband's particular concern, offered gently, repeatedly, as if illumination were a matter of moral character. Later, Miss Fenchurch found the bread bin relocated, nearer the window where it would stale faster. She moved it back without comment, then paused, her hand lingering on the lid. The bin had not travelled far, nor had it been placed carelessly. Someone had chosen the spot, likely believing it an improvement. The assumption carried with it a quiet authority that unsettled her more than intrusion ever could. That afternoon, Mr. Pike arrived with a purpose he did not articulate. He walked the house with Mrs. Bellringer, not inspecting, but observing, his gaze lingering on familiar details now newly charged. He commented on the roses needing attention, the gate hinge sounding stiff again. Each remark was framed as concern, not instruction, yet each carried the implication of obligation. "You could let someone handle it," he said lightly. Mrs. Bellringer smiled with practised ease. "I might," she replied, meaning nothing by it. He nodded, satisfied, as though permission had been granted. It was this, rather than the suggestion itself, that stayed with her after he left. Inspector Hale returned the following day, summoned not by event, but by accumulation. He listened as Mrs. Bellringer described the light, the bread bin, the roses. Miss Fenchurch added her own observations, precise and increasingly uneasy. The inspector did not interrupt. He allowed the list to form its own shape, attentive to the manner in which each example leaned toward the next. "None of this," Mrs. Bellringer said finally, "would trouble anyone on its own." "No," Inspector Hale agreed. "That is its strength," Miss Fenchurch frowned. "Strength?" "Yes," he said. "Assumptions made in good faith are difficult to challenge. They wear the appearance of care." He stood and walked the length of the hall, stopping where the staircase began. "Tell me," he said, "who would feel entitled to improve your comfort without asking?" Mrs. Bellringer considered. "People who believe they know what I need." "And why would they believe that?" She hesitated. "Because they have known me a long time?" Or, Miss Fenchurch said quietly, "because they knew him?" Inspector Hale turned to her. "Yes." The name did not need speaking. Mr. Bellringer's presence lingered still, not as memory alone, but as a pattern others continued to trace. His preferences, his corrections, his small acts of management had not ended with him. They had been absorbed, assumed, and quietly redistributed among those who believed continuity a kindness. That afternoon, the inspector said. When the footsteps were heard, someone was not trespassing. Mrs. Bellringer looked up. You think they believed they belonged? I think, he replied, they believed they were continuing something that had not yet been properly concluded. Miss Fenchurch's voice tightened. But they didn't ask? No, he said gently, because asking would have required acknowledging that the arrangement had changed. They spoke then of Mr. Bellringer's habits again, but this time not as routines, rather as permissions he had never formally granted but had nonetheless encouraged. He had accepted help easily. He had allowed correction. He had spoken often of efficiency, of keeping things in order for the sake of others. In doing so, he had made it difficult to know where assistance ended and authority began. People mean well, Mrs. Bellringer said. They always have. Yes, Inspector Hale said, which is why they rarely examine their motives closely. The afternoon wore on, the light shifting slowly across the hall. The inspector asked a final question, one he had been circling. Since his first visit, who, he said, would feel most uncomfortable if the house were allowed to change? Miss Fenchurch answered without thinking. Someone who has made themselves responsible for its sameness. Mrs. Bellringer closed her eyes briefly. Responsibility, she said, can be very convincing. Inspector Hale nodded, especially when it has never been challenged. They agreed then on a course of action that involved very little action at all. Mrs. Bellringer would make changes herself, small ones, deliberate ones. A chair moved, a routine altered, not announced, not explained, simply done. Miss Fenchurch looked uncertain. Won't that upset people? Yes, the inspector said. Slightly. And if they correct it? Mrs. Bellringer asked. Then, he replied, you will know who believes correction is still their role. The first test came sooner than expected. That evening, Mrs. Bellringer moved the lamp in the morning room from its customary table to a shelf nearer the door. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. The room felt different, less settled, as though acknowledging a new arrangement without approving it. The next morning, the lamp had been returned. Mrs. Bellringer stood before it, her expression unreadable. Miss Fenchurch joined her, hands clasped tightly. I didn't move it, Miss Fenchurch said at once. I know, Mrs. Bellringer replied. They did not replace it immediately. They waited. Later that day, Mr. Pike arrived, cheerful, carrying news of nothing in particular. His eyes flicked just briefly to the lamp. He said nothing. But when he rose to leave, he paused, then moved it back to the shelf, smiling apologetically. I thought, he said, you might prefer it where it was. Mrs. Bellringer watched him closely. I don't, she said. He froze, the lamp still in his hands. For a moment, uncertainty replaced his easy assurance. Oh, he said. I assumed. Yes, she replied calmly. You did. Inspector Hale, who arrived later and heard the account, did not appear surprised. Assumptions, he said, are rarely malicious. No, Mrs. Bellringer agreed, but they can be very persistent. That night, the house felt different. Again, not rearranged, not unsettled, but alert. Something had been corrected, gently but unmistakably. Someone, somewhere, would now have to decide whether to accept the correction or resist it. Either way, the pattern was no longer unchallenged. The afternoon established itself with quiet authority, arranging Bellringer House into its preferred sequence without asking permission. Light moved deliberately from room to room, pausing longest in the morning room, where it had always believed itself most useful. Mrs. Bellringer noticed this and allowed it, understanding that some habits deserved acknowledgement before they were altered again. She set out the teacups earlier than usual, not from anticipation, but from intent. The act felt declarative, though no one else yet knew it. Miss Fenchurch observed from the doorway, her expression thoughtful rather than anxious. She had begun to recognize that not intervening was sometimes the most meaningful choice available. At precisely 4, Mr. Pike arrived. He did not knock so much as announce himself with familiarity, the door opening as if expecting him. Mrs. Bellringer greeted him with a courtesy that revealed nothing. He took his usual chair, hesitated, then sat more carefully than before. "I thought," he said, glancing about. "Things look different." "They are," Mrs. Bellringer replied. He smiled, uncertain whether to treat this as humour or instruction. Tea was poured. The cups sat where she had placed them, not where they had always been. Mr. Pike noticed and said nothing, though the silence required effort. They spoke of the village first, of minor inconveniences and shared acquaintances. The conversation followed its accustomed path, but Mrs. Bellringer allowed it to wander slightly, introducing pauses where none had existed. Mr. Pike filled them reflexively, then stopped, aware that he was doing so. Miss Fenchurch entered and left the room without comment, her movements deliberately unhelpful. She did not adjust the tray, did not correct the placement of a spoon. Standing still, she discovered, was becoming easier. Inspector Hale arrived later, not invited to tea, but expected nonetheless. He entered quietly and observed before speaking. The room held him without resistance. "You've altered the order," he said. "Yes," Mrs. Bellringer replied. "And someone noticed?" "Yes." He nodded, satisfied. He did not sit immediately, choosing instead to stand near the window, where the light had begun to thin. "People who rely on routine," he said, "often believe it belongs to them." Mr. Pike shifted. "Routine belongs to everyone." "Only if agreed upon," the inspector replied mildly. They sat then, the inspector choosing a chair that had not previously been occupied. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Mr. Pike's gaze followed the movement, then returned to his cup. "This afternoon," Inspector Hale continued, "has been instructive." Mrs. Bellringer inclined her head. "That was my intention." He smiled faintly. "Then you've succeeded." The conversation resumed, but its tone had altered. Mr. Pike spoke less, listened more. When he did offer an opinion, he framed it carefully, as though testing whether it would be received. Mrs. Bellringer allowed some suggestions to pass unanswered. Others she declined politely, without explanation. At one point, Mr. Pike reached toward the lamp, then withdrew his hand, smiling awkwardly. "Force of habit," he said. "Yes," Mrs. Bellringer replied. "I'm revising mine." The moment passed without confrontation, yet it lingered, shaping what followed. Inspector Hale observed with interest, his presence lending weight without pressure. Later, Miss Fenchurch returned, carrying a plate of biscuits she had not been asked to provide. She placed them on the table, then moved them again, positioning them slightly out of reach. "They're for later," she said calmly. Mr. Pike nodded, accepting the delay. The afternoon wore on, its order increasingly evident. No one corrected the clock when it chimed a minute early. No one closed the window when the air cooled. Small permissions were withheld, not unkindly, but decisively. When Mr. Pike finally rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. "If you need anything," he said, then stopped. Mrs. Bellringer looked at him steadily. "I'll ask," she said. He nodded, relieved and unsettled in equal measure, and left. Inspector Hale remained a moment longer. "You've shifted the pattern," he said.
"Now it will respond." "How?"
she asked. "That depends," he replied. on whether those accustomed to movement can accept stillness when it's no longer theirs to manage. Miss Fenchurch exhaled softly. And if they can't? Then, the inspector said, they will act. He took his leave, leaving the house quieter, but not emptied. Mrs. Bellringer moved the lamp again, this time without ceremony, placing it where she preferred. It stayed there. As evening approached, the rooms adjusted. Nothing resisted. Nothing corrected itself. The order of the afternoon held, fragile but intact. Upstairs the landing remained silent. No footsteps crossed it. The house did not test her resolve. For the first time since her husband's death, Mrs. Bellringer felt the house accept instruction without argument. It was not approval, exactly, but recognition. The order had been established. What remained was to see who would respect it. The silence that followed was not immediate. Bellringer House did not surrender its habits all at once. It tested them. First, the way an old body tests a new posture, shifting weight carefully to see what protests. The evening passed without incident, but Mrs. Bellringer sensed restraint rather than absence, as though something had chosen not to move. She slept lightly, not from fear, but from attention. In the small hours, the house made its usual adjustments, a pipe settling, the wind worrying at a window. None of it suggested passage. When she woke before dawn, the landing remained untroubled, the carpet unmarked by sound or shadow. Miss Fenchurch noticed it too, though she would have struggled to name it. She moved through her morning tasks with unfamiliar ease, not because there was less to do, but because she no longer felt compelled to anticipate. Correction. She left a door ajar. It stayed that way. She passed a chair without aligning it. Nothing followed. The day unfolded with cautious normality. No visitors arrived. The telephone did not ring. The house seemed to listen, but no longer to expect. Inspector Hale came in the late afternoon, not summoned, but invited by circumstance. He was shown into the morning room and seated without ceremony. Mrs. Bellringer did not offer tea. He did not ask for it. "It's quiet," he observed. "Yes," she said, "properly so." He looked toward the stairs, then back to her. "No further adjustments?" "No." "And no resistance?" "No." Miss Fenchurch joined them, standing rather than sitting. The choice felt appropriate. "Nothing has moved," she said. "Not since yesterday." Inspector Hale nodded. "Then the pattern has accepted correction." Mrs. Bellringer studied him. "Or it's waiting?" "Yes," he agreed. "But waiting is different from insisting." They spoke then, calmly and without ceremony, of what had been learned. No accusation was made because none was required. Mr. Pike's assumption had been revealed, corrected, and quietly withdrawn. He had not returned. He would, Mrs. Bellringer suspected, but not in the same manner. "The footsteps," she said. "That afternoon." Inspector Hale leaned back slightly. "A continuation," he said. "Not intrusion. Someone walking a route they believed still existed." "And the voices?" "Reassurance," he replied. "Offered to the house, not to you." Miss Fenchurch frowned. "To the house?" "Yes," he said. "To the idea of it. That if things were kept moving, nothing essential had ended." Mrs. Bellringer absorbed this. But things had ended? Yes. And that was difficult to accept. "For some," he said, "more than others." They sat with this, the silence now companionable rather than charged. The inspector rose at last, adjusting his coat. "You didn't need confrontation," he said. "Only clarity." Mrs. Bellringer smiled faintly. I'm tired of confrontation. And clarity, he added, is often quieter. He left them then, the door closing behind him without commentary. The house accepted the sound and released it. That evening, Mrs. Bellringer walked the house herself, not as her husband had, with purpose and repetition, but slowly, stopping where she wished. She stood at the base of the stairs, then ascended without listening for anything beyond her own steps. The landing received her without echo. She paused where the footsteps had once stopped. The window reflected her back, steady and unafraid. She did not speak. She did not wait. She turned and went on. Below, Miss Fenchurch heard her pass and felt no need to follow. The house did not require accompaniment. When night came, the floors remained silent. Not cautiously, not resentfully, but fully. Silence settled the way dust does when no one disturbs it, evenly and without intent. In the days that followed, Bellringer House resumed a life of its own making. Visitors came and went by invitation, suggestions were offered and received or declined without confusion. The lamp stayed where Mrs. Bellringer placed it. The chairs learned new distances from one another. Mr. Pike returned eventually with apologies that were unnecessary and an air that was more tentative than before. He stayed briefly. He did not adjust anything. When he left, the house did not react. Miss Fenchurch remained, though her role altered gently. She asked before acting. She discovered that asking was not a diminishment but a relief. The house responded with cooperation rather than instruction. On a quiet afternoon, Mrs. Bellringer stood once more in the morning room, tea cooling beside her. The light fell where it pleased. The stairs remained unused. She listened, not for sound, but for its absence. The footsteps did not return. The house had learned, at last, to stand still.